Very good morning, viewers. Today's topic of discussion is establishment and consolidation of the Turkish conquest, or establishment and consolidation of the Delhi Sultanate in India. This session we are going to have two sessions for this particular topic. In the first session from 12 to 12:45 we are going to concentrate on how the Turks, who were the Turks, the region to which they belonged, how they migrated and why they migrated from Central Asia to India, what were the factors, and what was the condition of India on the eve of the Turkish conquest. Then we are going to discuss how particularly the process through which they gradually succeeded in establishing their foothold in India and further consolidating their position, how they consolidated their position. And we are also going to discuss in this particular first session that what were the factors responsible for the Turks' success, or what were the factors responsible for the defeat of the Rajputs at the hands of the Turks. So in the first session, largely we are going to confine, we are going to discuss on these particular issues. In the second session, that is going to be from 1 to 1:45. In that we will pick up the threads from this particular session. Then we are going to discuss that what were the long-term and the short-term influences or impacts of the Turkish conquest. Then we are also going to discuss the challenges that the Turks faced when they first established their foothold in India. What were those challenges? These challenges were not only from the Indian side, they were not just the Indian challenges, but they were also facing the problems from within their own group, their own nobility. So along with this, the Indian challenges, their own challenges, there were certain outside elements also, those challenges they had to face. So all these we are going to discuss in the second session. Now coming to this particular very session, the period, the medieval period begins with the Turkish conquest. The Turks who came around, their incursions begin sometime around 1000 AD, and how gradually within a short span of 100 years they were able to establish their own sultanate in India. That is a very, very important watershed in the Indian history. A new ruling elite that was coming, establishing themselves. So who were these Turks, and what were the factors why they migrated towards India? This is the most important question related to the 12th century. In fact, if we see the world map during the 12th century, if we can precede the 12th century, that means from 10th to 12th century, these 2 centuries are very, very important. This historical background of these 2 centuries preceding the 12th century, when the Turks established their sultanate in India, is very, very important, not only for the for Indian history, but also from the history of the world, particularly Europe. It totally changed the European maps. And what were the major factor in changing this map of Eurasia? These were the movement of the barbaric hordes, movement of the nomadic hordes. So who these they totally changed the Eurasian map. So who were these barbarian nomads, hordes? We keep on hearing about them, which region they belong, and what were their important characteristic features that made them so important that they practically, if we take in Firdausi's language, who called themselves the line as civilized and the barbarians. So what made these barbarians overran the civilized, quote unquote, civilized or civilizations? So this is a very, very important issue. If you could show the first slide, please. If you see this first slide, this is a map of steppes of Mongolia. This is the region. If you can read there, on the upper side is the Lake Baikal, and the below the lake is not visible, but this is below, down south is the Lake Balkhash. So this is the main region that was the steppe region, the steppes region, where this was the home of all the nomadic hordes. These hordes, whether it's the Hunas, the Mongols, the Turks, they all originally belong to this region. There is the small, within the map there is a small colored map there. Lake Baikal and the Mongolian region is given. It is the blow up of this region is given. If you can see the second map, this would be even more clearer to you. That here the Lake Baikal, this is the entire map of the entire Eurasia. Then you can see that from Lake Baikal to Lake Balkhash, this region was the main region where these barbaric nomadic hordes were confining themselves. Now the important aspect related to these nomadic hordes who have totally changed the map of the world was that why important that these were the pastorals, but these were the pastoral communities, the pastoral tribes who were constantly moving. Movement was the crucial feature of these pastoral nomads in search of the grazing fields. But the important advantage that these tribes were having was that their main asset was the horses, as well as they were the mounted archers. So with the use of the horses and the mounted archers, they were being successful in overrunning the entire region of the Central Asia. They migrated from Central Asia towards from this eastern parts, from Lake Baikal side, from eastern parts towards the Central Asia, crossing Central Asia. If you can show the map, then they are crossing the Central Asia, migrating from Lake Baikal. They are crossing. Could you please show the map? Crossing the Lake Baikal. Then they are migrating towards Lake Balkhash. Then there are crossing the Central and the West Asian region, crossing the Aral Sea, reaching up to the Caspian, and almost the Ural Mountains forms the territorial limits of these hordes. Turks also belong to this area of the Central Asia. You need not show the map now. So these Central Asian hordes were very, very important tribes who overran the entire region. And as I was just discussing, that how these were very, very important. Now could you show the map again? So the important, this is the blow up of the Central Asia region. This region, if you can read, that there are Transoxiana, on your just below the Aral Sea is the Khwarizm territory. That is a deltaic region, a very, very fertile region. And the Transoxiana means it's the across the Oxus River, which the Arabs used to call this region as a Mawarun Nahar. So this region of Mawarun Nahar or Transoxiana is between the two rivers, Oxus and Jaxartes. It is also in the Middle Ages used to be called as Amu Darya and Sir Darya. So this is a very, very important region. If you can see that where the Transoxiana is written, it is being divided by a river, and where one of the most important region of the Sogdiana region, where the Sogs were inhabiting, was placed. And if you can read on your map, it is the two most important medieval cities, Central Asian medieval cities, the Bukhara and Samarkand, were placed in this region. And if you can recall, if you know that these are the two major important cities who were stationed on the main Silk Route area. So this is the area which was very, very important area, and which the Turks overran the entire region. Now coming to the we do hear about that it is the Mahmud of Ghazni and Mahmud of Muhammad Ghori. These are the two invaders who invaded, Turkish invaders who invaded the entire in the around from 11th 12th centuries and over in the entire North India. So if you can see, could you just please show the map again? If you can see that there is a region below towards the south of the Transoxiana, the whole tract of Afghanistan, where stationed the two main regions of these Ghazna and Ghor. These are the two most important crucial territories that played a very, very important role in rather from these two territories that the Turks from this region migrated. Now, very important and interesting part is that if I can quote Firdausi, then Firdausi was a 10th century, one of the most important Persian poet who is being credited to raise the status of the Persian language. Rather, his work, on account of his work, the Persian achieved the status of the classical language. So the Firdausi comments that how it is the river Oxus that divides the two region. On the other side are the barbarians, and on this side are the civilized one. The civilized one he was calling to the Arabs. So Arabs were the civilized ones he was calling. So whether the Firdausi's comments is just he is trying to show that there existed no contact, there was a sharp divide existed. Whether there was actually sharp divide existed between these barbarians and the civilized one, this is not the true story. As I just discussing that how these two important cities, the Samarkand and Bukhara, were stationed on the important trade Silk Route, and the Turk it was passing through this region of the Transoxiana. Definitely it is across the Oxus River. And another important is that it is not that they were not Arabs were not employing the Turks into or having no contact with the Turks. Rather, the Arabs were employing the Turks in their armies as mercenaries, slave mercenaries, and it was the Caliph Muttasim who is credited to, though the Khans also employed them as the mercenaries, but it was the Caliph Mutassim who is credited to employ the Turks in large number in these areas. But the important feature that why this region of Gaur and Ghazna came into prominence, actually with the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, it is when the polity start fragmenting, the regional foci of center started emerging up, and it was the Alaptigin who established himself as an independent governor of Samarkand. Sorry, not Samarkand, Sassanid governor. He established himself at Ghazna, and it is actually he and his successor Mahmud of Ghazna, Mahmud of Ghazna was one of the most important and the prominent ruler of the Ghaznavite period. So it is Mahmud of Ghazna who was responsible even to bring Islam in the territory and rather Islamizing and Persianizing the whole territory of Ghazna in this area. So it is the Islam as well as all credit goes to Mahmud of Ghazna. So the inroads, Turkish inroads into Indian territories, the credit goes to Mahmud of Ghazna, and it was in AD 1000 that he defeated Jaipal. It was the first in Turkish inroads in India, and since then you can see that these Turkish inroads became a continuous feature. This up to 1030 AD, he keep on intermittently coming, invading the Indian territories with regular intervals, and the chief target rather of Mahmud of Ghazna's territory attacks were the temples, because these temple towns were the main places where the large quantity of wealth was stored, and that's why we are finding that it is whether it was Kalinjar, Mathura, Kannauj, Thaneshwar, all were the temple towns. The most famous of that is Somnath. So all the centers which Mahmud of Ghazna attacked were the temple towns, and from there he had collected large amount of booty. But the important impact of Mahmud of Ghazna's conquest, attacks or inroads was that it very much exposed the weaknesses of the fragmented Indian polity, that they were not in a crisis situation, they are not able to unite and pose a consolidated defense against an invader. The other important aspect was that how continuous inroads, continuous attacks also suppressed to an extent the Indian resistance. They were not able to consolidate their defense when almost 100 years later, when Muhammad Ghori attacked India and was able to establish the Delhi Sultanate, and this was the main factor behind Muhammad Ghori's conquest, because when he came, he was already having a background behind him. But it would be important and interesting to see that I'm not going right now to take into detail that how Muhammad Ghori consolidated himself or established the Sultanate, but what was the position and condition of India, and why the Indian various polities were not being able to successfully pose a united strength or united defense against the invading Turks. And it would be interesting if Professor Khan could highlight in detail the condition of India, socio-political economy on the eve of the Turkish conquest. Professor Khan, please.
Thank you, Abha. Just now you listened to my colleague Dr. Abha Singh. She very details she discussed what was the situation in Central Asia from where the Turkish invasion took place to India, and around the turn of the century 1200 Muhammad Ghori was able to conquer larger portions of northern India, and gradually Turks could establish their sultanate. What I have been asked by Abha is to just give you a brief idea about what was the condition of India at that point of time when Muhammad Ghori's invasion is taking place, and how was India situated at that time. As you must have read in your course material also, India at that time was divided into a large number of political entities. A number of kingdoms were spread throughout the length and breadth of the country, and these small kingdoms were having very strong feudal characteristics. What is this feudal? What we call at that time, India had a Indian feudalism prevalent in most of the northern part of the India and beyond also. Feudalism as a political system, as a political economic system. In feudalism, the rulers had carved out, given some territories of land to their subordinates, and these were called feudal lords. Who were these people to whom these territories were given? Broadly, we can list three types of persons who were given such grants, which were called feudal grants. First, of course, were the officials. King, instead of giving cash salaries to their officials, would give them small territories in the form of some villages, a larger territory, 100 villages, 200 villages, depending on the status of the official, to one of the officials, and those officials will manage then those territories and will be called feudal lords of that king. Second category of persons who were given such lands were defeated Rajas, smaller chiefs and all who were defeated by the Rajas and surrendered to the Raja after defeat. They were asked to continue as feudal lords of the Raja, and they were left with the whole territory or some portions of their territory along with all the rights on those territories, of course under the subordination of the king. So that was the second type of people. And third type of people were some influential zamindars or chiefs who were given this position of feudal lords. These had accepted the overlordship of the king. So these feudal lords we see come from three basic backgrounds: officials of the king, defeated Rajas, and some influential chiefs or zamindars of various territories. Though they were not called zamindars, they were called zamindars only later on, but at that time all these categories of people were known by different names. What were these names? That is would be useful for you to know. These were called Rajas, Ranakas, Samantas or Bhogikas, and some big ones of them, Mahamandaleshwar, Mahasamanta, etc. These were the titles. So these people were having certain rights and obligations. What were these rights and obligations? Their right was to collect land revenue from these territories under them. That was number one responsibility, that they would collect the land revenue, they will give a share of that revenue to the Raja or the king. All these Samantas, that was the main responsibility. Their second major responsibility was that whenever the Raja was at war with any other kingdom, then these Samantas will provide with men and material. Men means they will provide the soldiers to fight the war on behalf of the king, and they would provide the material for war in the form of weapons, in the form of other necessities, in the form of animals, etc. So these were the responsibilities of these Samantas. And these Samantas were hereditary. After the father, son would succeed, and so on and so on. Though in principle the Raja would approve the next Samanta, but in due course of time they all became hereditary. So a Samanta's son would also become Samant, and therefore they will have these feudal connections with the king. Now the question is, were these feudal lords and king and there were no other categories? No, it was not the case. Even these Samantas or the feudal chiefs would, sub-feudation was also operational. They will further divide their territory into some other subordinates, and in this process a chain of sub-feudatories was formed. So there were all sorts of people who were enjoying certain superior rights over land, and they were under a Samanta. Then Samantas were under the king. A hierarchical structure was formed. So in this way we notice that right from 4th, 5th century onward, Indian political system was based on some feudal order, and this order was a chain of feudatories and sub-feudatories who were appointed and given rights by the king, and they owed their allegiance, not only allegiance but subordination of the king, and they will provide king with land revenue surplus, they will provide the king with other necessities, and a situation had emerged when all important positions were given to this group of people only within the ruling system. In the whole polity, all these feudal lords were appointed in important positions by the king, and they held the sway in all political matters. So that was the nature of the polity at the eve of the Turkish conquest. So that is one part. Second part was, in actual terms, how was the whole territory of India divided into various kingdoms. So whole country of India was divided into, as I said, small kingdoms. First inroads by the Turks were made in the territory of northern India. So what was the situation of northern India mainly at that time? That Palas, a ruling dynasty, was ruling in the east with Bengal and nearby territories under them. Then there were Gurjar Pratihara Empire in the northern India. Actually, after the fall of the Harshvardhan, which was the last biggest empire in India in 6th, 7th century, after that these smaller kingdoms had emerged. Of these, in northern India, Gurjar Pratiharas were most powerful, and with the fall of this Gurjar Pratihara kingdom, then there emerged different Rajput principalities and kingdoms within North India. So within North India, this political power was mainly in the hands of Rajputs. Rajput is a very specific group of people who were holding these territories. There are various stories about their origin and all. Mainly it was these, as a race, as a clan, they were the warrior groups. Their origin was traced differently, either from moon or sun, to give them more importance and give them some sort of legitimacy. But in nutshell, they were in some way related to Kshatriyas. They were descendants of Kshatriyas or various clans of Kshatriyas, and they were called by a generic name of Rajputs. They may be different types of Rajputs, but generally by a common word they were called the Rajputs, and their main principalities at that time were three in North India: Gahidwalas, who had their territory and kingdom in Kannauj and the adjoining regions. Then there were Parmars, who held sway over Malwa and the territories around it. Then there were Chauhans who held sway in Ajmer, and they expanded their territory. In due course of time, Chauhanas were emerging as most powerful in the northern India, and they were the ones who first entered into a direct clash with the Muhammad Gauri. Apart from them, other important kingdoms in India at that point of time were in Kashmir, Damras, in Jabalpur and adjoining territory, which is now called Jabalpur and all, Madhya Pradesh, which is modern Madhya Pradesh. There were Kalachuris, then there were Chandelas in the region of Bundelkhand, which is at the border of UP and modern Madhya Pradesh. Then there were Chalukyas in the area of Gujarat, which is a modern Gujarat province, but it had some portions of the Maharashtra also, which is at present common. That time were common in Maharashtra and Gujarat. Then there were Tomars who had established their hold over Delhi. Then in Bengal, Senas had emerged as powerful kings. So therefore, as we see, and Deccan of course was under Rashtrakutas and other smaller kingdoms. So therefore, we notice that on the eve of the Turkish conquest, Indian political system, Indian polity, what we call, was feudal in nature. Number two, a large number of smaller kingdoms were spread throughout all parts of the country, and the basic feature of these principalities and kingdoms, especially in the North India, was that they were always at conflict with each other, because the Rajput polity was egalitarian. They had a notion of equality and all. Therefore, nobody would accept superiority of other, and they were constantly at war with each other to expand their territories and their areas of influence. So in such a political atmosphere, on the eve of the end of the 12th century, when these Turks under Muhammad Gauri attacked, and the process of the Muhammad Gauri's attack, conquest and all, I'll request my colleague Dr. Abha Singh to take the story beyond that.
Thank you, Professor Khan. Would you like, before we go, that Chhoot and other society, would you like to discuss right now?
We can discuss that with the reasons for the success of the Turks. You know.
Could you show the map again, please, on the screen? If you see this again down the Afghanistan region, if you can see that here where the N is ending, there is a I don't know whether you can see on the screen, there is a Ghor region, the entire region to which the Muhammad Gauri belonged, and this is the region between, it's a valley sort of a region. You can see that there are two rivers going, one going upwards, the other going downwards, and this is so it is a valley sort of region surrounded by the Hindu Kush mountain ranges in the modern Afghanistan region. So the important aspect related to this region, that this region is actually a valley landlocked country, but it is very, very fertile. It was a very, very fertile region. So the important advantages that this region was having was that of that it was very, very fertile. B, it is the region which was very, very rich in the iron ores. So the mineral that was very, very important to make the weapons and armory was very much available to them. Then the third important region, the third important aspect related to this region was that this region was very much known for its horse rearing. So the two most important ingredients, the important features that of warfare during the medieval period, the horses and the arms, availability of arms, the iron was very much present in the in this Ghor region. So these are the two important aspects that makes this region very, very important. The region was exporting arms and horses to other territories. Now this area to which the Muizzuddin Muhammad bin Sam, whom it's commonly known as Muhammad Ghori. We all know more commonly as Muhammad Ghori rather than Muizzuddin Muhammad bin Sam. So he belonged to this region. This is a region which was almost not very much frequently connected with other areas because being situated in the valley region, and you would be surprised to know that even the language that was spoken in this region when Mahmud of Ghazna went. He was the first among the Islamic rulers who went in and attacked this region. First, the Turkish one who went to this region and attacked the Ghor. So when he went there, he had to employ the interpreters to know the language, because he was not aware of the language. As far as the religion was concerned, they were probably the followers of the Mahayan Buddhism, and it is again the Mahmud of Ghazna who is credited to spread Islam in the region. And from here that you will find that the Islam, it is the Muhammad Ghori who once Islamized, and then he brought as an invader, he brought the Islam and established the Islamic kingdom in India, the Delhi Sultanate. The Turkish inroads begin, Muhammad Ghori's Turkish inroads begin as early as 1175. If you can see the chronological list of the Muhammad Ghori's conquest, could you show the slide, please? So in this, there is the 1175 is the attack on Multan, and it culminates in 1192 in the Battle of Tarain. In between there are number of attacks. First he occupied Multan. You can see on your screen various chronological details are there. I am not going into the detail. Multan, Uch, Naharwala, Peshawar, Lahore, Tabar Hind, Bhatinda, and finally the Chauhans were defeated, though at first in 1191 in the Battle of Tarain, Muhammad Ghori's armies were defeated, but in 92 ultimately they were succeeded in crushing the Prithviraj Chauhan's army, and they established the Delhi Sultanate. This is a very, very important watershed in the Indian history, because it ultimately led to the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, and it also exposed the weakness of the Rajputs or rather not only just showed the weaknesses of the Rajput, but this is the point. From then onwards you will see that the Rajputs were never been able to recover further. They were never able to control Delhi. Then onwards they were gradually on and on were successful, were being receded into the region of the Rajputana that commonly now is known as the Rajputana region, and from Delhi their hold was once for all ended. So this is a very, very important. Muhammad Ghori's conquests are very, very important feature. Muhammad Ghori not stayed after here for long. Rather, 1192, after the success, Muhammad Ghori's success, he left his journal, the Turkish slave, his slave but Turkish journal, Qutbuddin Aibak, who to consolidate the gains and for further expansion. So under Qutbuddin Aibak's leadership with other journals, it was left to Qutbuddin Aibak to further consolidate the gains, and by 1206 you will see that the Turks were successful in reaching, if you could see the map on your screen, then the Turks were successful in reaching as far as Bengal, Lakhnauti. You know that how Bakhtiyar Khilji was very, very important. Bakhtiyar Khilji's attacks in Lakhnauti region, he was successful in giving a defeat to the Lakshmanas and Palas and Senas who were ruling in that Lakhnauti region. So almost till Bengal they have reached. You can see that the boundaries of their occupation are given on the map. If we see the then in 1206 Muhammad Ghori died, and now the Qutbuddin Aibak had to face lot of problem, because it were the various journals of Muhammad Ghori that they were very, very important. Muizi journals, particularly Yalduz was very, very important, whom Muhammad Ghori's elder brother had actually given the recognition. He recognized him. So the Qutbuddin Aibak had to face almost all through his period, short span of time, 1206 to 10. His reign was just for 4 years. He died in 1210, but he almost all the time busy tackling Yalduz and other journals, and rather he was forced to shift his capital from Delhi to Lahore almost all the time there. And actually, if we can call his successor in 1210 Iltutmish, who was his Turkish slave, his journal, as well as his son-in-law, the task was left to Iltutmish to consolidate the gains of Muhammad Ghori and Aibak. If we can see that how the Qutbuddin Aibak Iltutmish was able, his reign lasted up to 1236. He had to tackle the three important fronts. One, he had to tackle the old Muizi journals. He had to face the Mongol problem. Then he had to consolidate and expand the empire, the territories that were being left to him. He gradually tried to consolidate these, but you will find that it was actually Alauddin Khalji, because most of the time he was involved in handling the in rather consolidation process rather than in expansioning the territories that were already with him, expansioning the boundaries of the empire. And it was actually the Alauddin Khalji that who the task was left to Alauddin Khalji, who tried to do the expansionist task which was left by his successor, because Balban hardly could get time. He was most of the time involved with the problems that he was facing from the Mongol side, that we are going to discuss little later. So it was Alauddin Khalji. And Alauddin Khalji's territory, if you can see the map now, the Alauddin Khalji has actually expanded in Central India towards West Asia, and it were the Ulugh Khan and Nusrat Khan. These were the two main journals who were involved in the expansionist process, and they were the instrumental in these successes in Central Asia and Rajputana. Then coming to Deccan and South, here at Devgiri, when the Alauddin Khalji was successful in conquering the Devgiri, here the greatest find of Alauddin Khalji was the Malik Kafur, and Malik Kafur now was it was he who was instrumental in the entire Deccan and South India campaigns. He actually conducted the entire Deccan and South India campaigns under Alauddin Khalji. But Alauddin Khalji was not interested as far as Deccan and South India was concerned in annexing these territories. Rather, he just conquered those territories and let them rule in lieu of paying a regular tribute. He was not interested in expansion. But if we see the Tughlaqs, if you can see these are the Alauddin Khalji's conquest. If we see the Tughlaqs, it was Muhammad bin Tughlaq who was interested in conquering the territory, annexing these, and you will be finding that here he established in the Deccan and South India, he established his own administration, his own Amirs, the Khwarizm Amirs, that we will be reading about them, we will be knowing about them, the Sada Amirs that were instrumental in establishing their own independent regional kingdoms later, during the later phase. So this was this way the Delhi Sultanate got the expansionist process continued under Alauddin Khalji and Tughlaq. After Tughlaq there was not further expansion, rather it was the squeezing process that had started under the Sayyas and the Lodhis, and by the Lodhi period the whole entire polity got fragmented. Now we have discussed up to the expansionist process. We are going to discuss in the next session how the Turks were being able to establish themselves, how and why they were successful against the Rajput. That Professor Khan is going to deal in the second session. Thank you very much.